Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Queensland State Archives. I'm Cara, State Manager Queensland for National Archives of Australia, and I'm delighted to MC today's collaborative event between Queensland State Archives and National Archives of Australia for International Archives Week, Archives and Justice, Responsibility, Rights and Future Possibilities. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today, the Yugara people, and Turrbal peoples where the National Archives of Australia Queensland office is located, and other nations and clans connected to this place. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. We acknowledge the enduring strength, resilience and knowledge of First Nations communities whose cultural practices, oral histories and keeping places represent the oldest continuing living cultures in the world. We'd now like to screen a short video recording from the Honourable Deb Frecklington, Attorney General of Queensland and Minister for Justice.
Good morning. I'm proud to be supporting today's panel discussion. What a great opportunity to recognise the invaluable role State Archives plays in our justice system. Archives are more than just a collection of historic records. They're the cornerstone of transparency, accountability, and the protection of individual rights, essential to our democracy. So as your Minister for Integrity, I really recognise the important role State Archives play in holding public officials and our institutions to account. By preserving the evidence of decisions and actions, public trust in our democratic system endures. I would like to thank the Queensland State Archives and the National Archives of Australia for hosting this important discussion during International Archives Week and for your tireless work preserving and providing access to public records. Your commitment really does matter to Queenslanders. And a big thank you to our esteemed panellists, State Archivist Louise Howard, Simon Froude, Catherine Scott and Kate Connors for sharing your insights and expertise. To everyone in the audience, your interest reflects a shared commitment to justice and integrity, and it's through such informed engagement that the significance of our state archives continued to be recognised and valued today.
This year's International Archives Week theme, developed by the International Council on Archives, is Archives for Justice, Rights, Memory and Futures. It highlights the important role archives play not only in preserving records of the past, but also in supporting accountability, protecting rights, shaping collective memory, and helping us imagine a more just and inclusive future. Today's panel discussion, Archives and Justice, Responsibility, Rights and Future Possibilities, invites us to consider archives as more than historical collections. Archives are living systems of evidence, memory and connection. They shape how histories are understood, whose voices are heard, and how communities and institutions engage with both the past and the future. We're proud to present this event as a collaboration between Queensland State Archives and National Archives of Australia, bringing together shared expertise and perspectives to explore the enduring significance of archives in contemporary society. Convening today's panel discussion, we're very pleased to welcome Stefan Armbruster. Stefan is an award-winning journalist with more than 30 years' experience reporting on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, multicultural communities and the Pacific region. A strong advocate for media freedom and public accountability, Stefan brings both deep expertise and thoughtful insight to today's conversation. Stefan will also introduce our esteemed panellists who will guide today's discussion. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stefan Armbruster.
Thank you very much, Cara, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, both past and present. I had a quick look around the interweb to find some sort of quotes and things to talk about archives. I found this one that said, archives are often seen as places of storage, but there are also places of evidence, memory, identity and power. They shape who is remembered, who is believed, and whose story becomes part of the national record. I thought that was a really lovely quote, and then I went to look for who said it. and it is completely made up by AI, which I, which is a very important thing I think that we'll talk about today as well. But as a journalist, I've dealt with archives a lot. I've been in the state and national archives, in the National Film and Sound Archive, in the Australian War Memorial, and lots of other archives, both here and internationally. It's been a very important part of my work as a journalist, and it affects so many people's lives in so many different ways that maybe aren't really considered. It's, you know, in courtrooms, obviously, there's land claims, citizenship applications, the stolen generations, just migrant family histories are just so vitally importantly recorded in the archives, compensation cases, truth-telling processes, and now there's a really important debate about digital identity and what the role that AI plays in archives as well. So we'll be talking about a lot of those issues here today with our four esteemed panelists. And it's also something that's not just in Australia, but across the Pacific. Archives sit at this, for us, at this sort of intersection of memory, power, and survival. I work a lot in the Pacific, and we were talking about this before we came into the room. We're very lucky here to have these archives. I've seen archives in complete disarray. Well, some in Australia are as well, in complete disarray. disarray. And for those communities, it's really, really important that they're preserved, because their histories are there, and if they're not preserved, they can be ignored or erased or just completely displaced in a whole society. So let's get on to our wonderful panelists. We're very lucky, very, very lucky to have this incredible group of people sitting together. I think first time all five of us sat together has been today. Let me start, please, with Simon Froude. He's the Director General of the National Archives of Australia, and when I Googled you, it said you're driving the transformation of the organisation to ensure the preservation and accessibility of Australia's official records.
Thank you, Stefan. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation to be here today. My name's Simon Froude, Director General, National Archives, and that's right. You know, I think for me the drive for me and the passion that I get out of this work is very much around the accessibility of the archive. So access for me is critical, and I think that goes in a long way to that notion of justice in the archives as well. And we were asked to bring to the table a bit of a find or something that we thought might be of interest to the audience. And so one of the things that we've uncovered recently in the National Archives collection, and just to give you some I guess understanding of the scope of the collection, it contains about 54 million items, so it stretches over 360 kilometres of material with about 10 petabytes of digital material. And one of our oldest, if not the oldest, digital record in the collection is a magnetic computer tape from 1970. And for many, many years, we thought that the material and the information on that tape had been lost. We weren't able to recover it. We'd had attempts in the 90s and early 2000s to recover that material, and the view at the time was that it was unrecoverable, that it had been corrupted, and that the record was essentially lost to the nation. We've picked up that material again, the tape, and we've worked with a third-party provider who's been able to actually recover that material, which was in itself quite an astounding feat, given that material is 50 plus years old, and in a state and in a format that wasn't readable. And what we found, and we didn't know what was on that magnetic computer tape, and what we found on that tape when the data was recovered was an Aboriginal population register from 1970s in the Northern Territory, which contains over 26,000 names of Aboriginal people living in and around Darwin at that time. And for me, that the fact that information is now accessible to individuals is really important, because it talks to family reconnection, it talks to native title, land claims, and a whole host of other things, including redress and the like. And so we are. It's that tape and that information is hugely powerful. And so we're working very closely. We've got our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement team. We're working very closely with our Northern Territory Aboriginal Advisory Group to make sure that that information is now managed and accessible in a culturally appropriate and safe manner. You know, the information on there, as I said, is a really powerful, I think, sends a really powerful message for the role that archives play and why we do what we do.
Thanks very much, Simon. That sounds amazing, really. Louise Howard, sitting next to Simon, has been the Queensland State Archivist since 2021. Yep. And leading significant reforms in public record legislation.
Yes.
Yes. Including the Public Records Act in 2023. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And is a passionate advocate for robust record keeping to support transparency, accountability, and public trust. So it's probably good that you're sitting next to each other because you can get some tips. Can you tell us a little bit more, Louise?
Thank you, Stefan. Yes. So here at State Archives, we're not quite the same size as National Archives. So we have about 3.7 million items, around 70 linear kilometres. This is the best job in the world, I think. I get to work in the past, present and the future all at the same time. I don't think there's too many other jobs where you can actually be involved in all of those temporal spaces and those people spaces. So it's an amazing privilege to have the job that I do. And I think when we were asked about a win to bring along or something that was important, I wanted to flag our new Public Records Act. In particular, when we're talking about accessibility, it's introduced a pro-disclosure approach. So it really has focused on ensuring that the records that we hold here are open and accessible. The value of the records we hold only comes to fruition when people actually access them and find value in them. Our aim is not just to preserve these things and lock them up and make sure they stay there. It's actually to say, what else can these be used for? So our new legislation introduced both a pro-disclosure approach, but also a requirement for public authorities to consider the reasonable steps they're taking in providing access to that. So around 60% of our collection is what we would call open. Around just under 40% has a restriction on it because we are balancing the tension of managing privacy and security with the desire to provide access to those records. The new legislation allows us to do that in a more governed and regulated way. So I'm really hopeful that we'll start to see a much more consistent decision-making pattern across government when they're considering how access to the records that we hold on their behalf. So we are the custodians. We don't own the records when they come here. We still manage them, but the particular government agency that's responsible for them makes those decisions. So very happy. Our old legislation was about 20 years old, so it was 2002. And we still refer to it as the new Act, even though it's been in place a little while now, and we're still very much looking to get more and more value from it.
Well, it was lovely to hear the Attorney General making a commitment to accountability and transparency at the opening of this then.
Absolutely.
Kate Connors, sitting to Louise's left. Kate Connors is the Victims Commissioner for Queensland. She's been in the job for about 4 months now, after a long history within the Queensland Public Service on 25 years working on child protection, youth justice, domestic and family violence, crime prevention and redress.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I'm the Victims Commissioner here in Queensland, and my role is to take and investigate and make recommendations around complaints under the Charter of Victims' Rights here for victims of violent crime. And then I also have a role under my legislation. I'm an advocate for all victims of crime in Queensland, and people can come and talk to me about their experiences in the justice system, and my advocacy goes straight to government. I'm an independent statutory officer as well. The example I wanted to bring, I suppose, is about contemporary record keeping. We have developed a new complaints data mechanism for our office. But what I wanted to say about it is because my role is to ensure that the voices of victims are, heard, protected, and the justice system changes to incorporate the voice of victims, every complaint that we have has a role both as the individual complaint and the respect we give to the story of that victim. But we also use those complaints to do our systemic advocacy. So for a lot of victims that come to us, that is the first time they have been able to tell their story in a way that they want to tell it. When you're in the justice system, that is around the state and the accused and how you work out what happened in the facts of those within the boundaries of the rules of evidence. When people come to us, they can tell us what really happened to them and how they felt about it. So that's actually an extraordinary record that you don't get anywhere else in the justice system. So I suppose in a contemporary sense, I take my obligations really seriously to honour what people have told me, to protect that information, and then to have a system that is a way that I can use all of those experiences in a respectful way to advocate for victims of crime in Queensland.
Thanks, Kate. And finally, Catherine Scott, to my right. Catherine is a General Counsel with the Department of Justice, a Senior Executive Lawyer, it says in the description. I haven't heard of one of those before.
We're prolific.
and interestingly spent 4 months recently acting as the Queensland Human Rights Commissioner.
Yes, I did. Thank you so much, Stefan. It's lovely to be here today. I am, as Stefan said, General Counsel for the Department of Justice. I am what is commonly referred to as a rusted-on public servant. I have been in the public service for a very long time. I started out working in the criminal law space with the Director of Public Prosecutions, quickly figured out that I did not have the intestinal fortitude to do criminal law and moved over into the civil stream. And I have worked across many government agencies, including Queensland Health, Department of Premier and Cabinet, but I've spent most of my time with the Department of Justice. I started as General Counsel a couple of years ago, and it's honestly the best job in the world. Love it. And one of the teams that sits underneath me is the Right to Information and Privacy team. So I have I think, a very different perspective to anyone else on the couches in terms of that access to justice and the importance of good record keeping. Also, very selfishly, I have skin in the game when it comes to good record keeping because I have been involved in commissions of inquiry where we have historically had deficient record keeping practices, which has made it difficult then to bring out that whole story at a commission of inquiry, which is a very important part of the justice process. So I think my perspective today is really around the importance of good record keeping and the preservation of these records for both now and into the future, and the impact that that has not only on justice for individuals, but also the administration of justice as a whole.
Thanks, Catherine. And so this panel session is part of International Archives Week, and the theme of it is Archives for Justice. And so I'd just like panelists to just give us briefly, or tell us briefly, what does that actually mean to you in your workplace and the work you do?
I'll kick off. Thank you, Stefan. So yeah, look, I think when I was thinking about the whole International Archives Week and the theme around Archives for Justice, sometimes the phrasing that's used can be a bit glib. It can be a bit of a throwaway. But I think I actually think the ICA has nailed it here, because I think everything we do in an archive, from the advice and the support that we provide to government agencies, whether it be federal government agencies or Queensland state government agencies, to the preservation of the material once it's come into the collection, to the accessibility of the collection, is all about building trust and understanding and accountability across government. The records that we have in our collection are the evidence of decisions that are made by government employees, and those decisions impact on the lives of everybody in Queensland or across the country. And so for individuals to be able to access that material is a really important part of our democratic system. It's really important that we hold those records, as Louise said, as custodians of that material, as stewards of that material for current generations, but also for future generations, because the value of the records that we hold are unknown. We don't, you know, a record can be created today for one particular purpose, but in 10, 20, 50 years' time, the use of that record is, you know, we don't know what it's going to be used for. We don't know what value it's going to have. You know, it only takes a single record, a single page, or a single word on a page to really change somebody's life. And I think that's the power of the material that we hold. And a lot of that is around justice, redress, rights and entitlements, family connections, all of those types of things. So I think that's what it means to me.
When I think about archives for justice, I guess I think it even broader than not just a justice system and thinking of a criminal justice system, but justice almost as a term, fairness and equity, and the value and the power records have. So records hold power, information holds power. When people have access to that information, they can be empowered to take steps they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. So I think to reflect on what Simon said, the role that we have within archives to ensure that those records are maintained, that they're discoverable. So one of the challenges we have, and this touches on good record keeping, is that our records sometimes say bundle of general correspondence. So 3.7 million items might be a register of 2,000 pages. So finding the information within the archives and that role of the archivist to help people discover the information that has power to them and can change the course of their life is critical. So I think that intersection of archives and our role in underpinning that can't be underestimated.
In thinking about archives for justice, I was absolutely building on what Louise and Simon have said, the power of what is in documents, you know, and I've worked in the child protection system as well, and in thinking about the rights of people who've suffered historical abuse in that system, the power of those documents that people may have never known about what happened to them and the ability to access them and see them and then be able to seek redress for the things that have happened in their life and the failures of government decision making. I also think now when I think about archives for justice, I think, and again going back to when I think about the kind of material that we collect in complaints, unlike things that are like court transcripts or police records, it's important to also have the records of how people felt. So I think, you know, I think about what archives in the future will look at. You know, I worked at the Child Abuse Royal Commission, and 8,000 people came and did a private session with that commission and told the story about what happened to them. Those have all been turned into a public record. Those people were all asked to give a message to Australia that you can still see on the website, or you can go to the National Library and see the message to Australia about what happened to them, and importantly about how they felt. And I think in our archives we will have what happened, the administrative decision making, but we will also have in the future what has been missing is sometimes we can extrapolate the human experience from looking at those documents, but I think we won't have that sort of systemic change in the justice system that I'm looking for and people are looking for, where there is a real balance, where we really hear the damage that is caused to people, in my case by crime or in other aspects of government decision making, while we also capture how people felt. And that witnessing, that bearing witness, for example, that happened at the Child Abuse Royal Commission, significantly changed how people in Australia feel about our past and about our contemporary understanding of issues like child abuse as well. So those things are of enormous significance.
Just building on what the other panel members have said, I think the justice element of archives, it can mean so many different things to so many different people depending on your lived experience. My background is significantly in administrative law, which is the law of government decision making. So I'm a bit of a nerd. I love, the evidence taken into account and the crafting of a good government decision. Now, government decisions, of course, range from deeply personal issues to the awarding of a mining lease to excluding a parent from a educational facility for a range of reasons. The spectrum of government decision making is fascinatingly broad. The importance of and the justice side of that record keeping around those processes is, like all things, we should be learning from the mistakes of the past. So when we are properly recording those things and we are archiving them appropriately, that is then a resource we can look back to learn from and do better. When we know better, we do better. On a personal note, for me, my dad recently passed away, and unfortunately for my children, he was deeply affected by dementia for many years in the leading up to his passing. My brother and his wife had fortuitously, before the dementia really robbed us of who he was, gifted him a Storyworth subscription, which is essentially you get sent a series of questions on a weekly basis, you write a story about it, and then it gets published into a book. My children are able to look at that record of his stories, of his life, and build a connection to a man that they were not able to build that connection with in person the way that the rest of us were. And that book has become a deeply important thing to them, and a connection with a grandparent that they were never able to know in the way that those of us who had more time with him did. And I feel the same way about the records that are held. And government has a huge responsibility to not only record the mining lease decisions and the everyday decisions, but also to properly record the human experience and the human connection that makes these decisions mean so much, not only to individuals but also groups of people. So for me, I think that the theme of this International Archives Week is spot on.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So not much disagreement between our panellists, but all coming from very different perspectives to this issue. So what we've heard is archives are not really passive. The archives, they determine what governments can prove, what citizens can challenge, whether rights can be restored, and whether abuses are exposed. Is that fair enough to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, if you cast your mind back to a year ago, and I know a lot has happened in the last year, but I want to take you overseas. We had the election of the President of the United States, the current one, and it was quite shocking, I think, for everyone what suddenly happened after that. There was a huge revision of US history and expunging and rewriting of their government records and their archives, which doesn't just have impacts in the US, but has impacts around the world in terms of the information that's accessible. And it made me wonder, in relation to this, what safeguards are there in Australia for something like that not to happen here, that the integrity of the historical records are protected from political pressure? I'll leave it open to you.
I'll let Louise go first, and then I'll just. She said.
So I'm happy to step into that, because our recent legislation has actually brought in further safeguards to help with that. So I am a public servant. I'm not a full independent statutory individual as Kate is in her role, but I have specific independent powers. And one of those in particular is around the disposal of records. So no government official can direct me to authorise the disposal of records. That is a decision that is made by myself alone. The new legislation also introduced the requirement for any direction from the minister I report to be in writing and to be published in the annual report. Now, as with all regimes that we've seen across the world, things can move, legislation can change. But what those particular tenets in our legislation introduce is transparency. So it can't be done without visibility, and coming back to the theme of records, provide accountability and transparency. That publication of those decisions sends a message as to what's happening. I think it is a genuine issue. I do think we have to remember too, we talk about the rewriting of history. That can happen whether the record changes or not. So when we look at the revisionist histories, they will look at the same records and interpret them very differently. So the record itself doesn't have to change for the narrative associated with the record to change. I think it's a misnomer to think that the records are the absolute point of truth. The records are, even though an archival principle is that we don't interpret. So we provide context, we provide description, but we're not the researchers who are going to go in there and actually add our own layer of interpretation about what does this record mean when we're bringing it into the catalogue. That might happen through exhibitions and things like that. But our role really is to try to remain as neutral as possible, but we're human. And humans are not objective, they are subjective to their own experiences. So even in what records were selected for retention 40 years ago versus what we are now looking at and saying, well, that record is important, has changed because the values of society have changed. So there are legislative protections. I think none of those are perfect, but for Queensland at least, they're pretty good. But they are not going to do it alone. It's actually a societal change and a cultural change that will hold a government of the day to account. The records are a tool for that, but the people have to use the tool.
Yeah, I might just, and I agree with everything Louise has said. I think what has struck me particularly over the last, 12, 18 months or so, and I think it's becoming more obvious, is that democracy is really fragile, and the systems of government we have and that are in place in democratic countries can be misused, they can be abused, they can be watered down, and we talk about, and our legislation is similar to Louise's legislation in many respects, except it's 40 years older, so it is in desperate need of an update. But even where you've got legislative principles in place, they can be undermined if people have the desire to undermine them. So one of the things that they have in the US is the Presidential Records Act, which essentially stipulates that the records that are created by the President and his Chief of Staff and advisors during the term of the presidency are public records and need to be preserved and made accessible to the citizens of the US. The current president is arguing against that and trying to undermine that piece of legislation. And for individuals who are interested and in democracy and are interested in the principles that underpin democracy, that's a really scary thing, because we can have all of the legislative safeguards that we want, but they can be undermined, and it doesn't take a lot to undermine them. It takes, the willpower of an individual or a number of individuals to do so. And so I think as archives, we all sort of sit as, we've talked already about the importance of the archival record for evidence and for accountability and transparency. And so archives play a deeply important role in underpinning democracy and our democratic principles, in understanding civics and what government is and does and why, the importance of individuals having a vote and the right to vote and the power of all of that. So there's a significant responsibility, I think, that archives play in that, in building democratic resilience and understanding across the country, so that we don't allow those principles that we hold really dear to us to be undermined. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Simon. Catherine, oh,
Yeah.
you've been involved in a number of commissions of inquiry that involve require a lot of background material from the archives. We were talking, we had a little chat about what we were going to talk about yesterday, and we should have recorded that one and the one in the green room just now. It's been really fascinating. We've got so much ground to cover, and we're only going to really touch on a few things today, which is really unfortunate. We could make this a podcast series. But Catherine, you're telling us about the two DNA commissions of inquiry, and that you found it incredibly important using the state archives for that, but not just the archives, but the corporate knowledge retained by the people working in those sectors as well.
Absolutely. So in situations like a commission of inquiry where you are delving back into the past, and when there is an absence of corporate knowledge or lived experience within that space, you are relying on those records. So you are relying on people having properly recorded decisions, having properly kept those records, having kept them in a way that they are able to be found again, or meaningfully located in a short time frame when you are responding to a commission of inquiry. So that the challenge really is to put enough importance on that record keeping now, and to really value that for not only now but also into the future. So in the two commissions of inquiry into the DNA forensic testing in Queensland, there was a large historical focus on that once the findings of the first commission of inquiry came out. And there was a lot of historical case review that needed to be completed in order to rectify the wrongs that had been identified by that commission. It was vitally important for the state government to be able to rely on those records, identify those cases where further forensic testing needed to be done to ensure the proper administration of justice. And that is just one example of, I'm sure there are thousands like it, where sometimes you're lucky enough to have that corporate knowledge still.
That was the interesting thing you were talking about, the human element.
Yes. So one of the issues that came out of the Commission of Inquiry, I'm not sure if anyone followed it quite as closely as I did, there was a very low attrition rate of staff in forensic science. It's a really niche profession. You want to work in forensic science, basically you do it here. So thankfully there were some very long-standing employees that had that corporate knowledge that we could go to and would know where the records were, where they were stored, what they said, oftentimes remembered specific cases. You're not always going to be that lucky. Most government agencies don't have that sort of longevity because I think the days of one job for life, they are gone, and people move around, they duck in and out of the public sector, private sector, not-for-profit. So it is improper and implausible to rely upon corporate knowledge when it comes to these things. That is why I will die on this hill, and I will go blue in the face saying it, as I do with my teams all the time. Record keeping is not an optional extra. It is part of our business. It is part of what we do. We are not doing our jobs properly if we are not doing that properly.
And thank you. And there was an interesting chat I had with Simon just before we came in. I didn't realise that Western Australia doesn't have a state archives, which is, to me, just extraordinary that there's a state in Australia, as one as big as WA, with the income it does, that just doesn't do that kind of record keeping. And I was reading about these state archives here in Queensland, and it described it as one of the most modern cloud-native digital preservation systems
Nice.
for born digital government records. Oh, isn't that? It took me a while I had to read that a few times.
So, born digital is a term that we use in the industry for records that were never physical. So sometimes you'll have a paper record that gets digitised. Born digital records started that way, stay that way. Unfortunately for government, often what would happen over past decades is it would start this way, get digitised, and then they would print it out again to save it. So there are boxes and boxes of records that were digital that are now printed out. Until 18 months ago, we didn't have the capacity to bring those permanent value born digital records into our custody. We do now. We have a digital archive. It has its wonderful description. It is pretty good. I think there's elements of it that are probably world leading. But again, there's that digital preservation component has a lot more to it than people think about. Anyone who owns a floppy disk or a CD-ROM, do you still have a computer that you can access that material on, even if you've got the CD-ROM on your shelf? So when we talk about, I think Simon's example there of the old magnetic tape, the ability to take file formats that no longer have supported software to preserve them, to look at the fixity of those items, to ensure that they will remain accessible forever. And this is something when people go, 100 years? No, forever. So the idea is, and managing that with the raft of systems that government uses to create records now. So geospatial files, databases, and moving into the world of AI. So there's some more there. But yeah, we do have a digital archive that we're quite proud of.
Now, Catherine, Kate, you're different to all the other panelists here.
In the best possible way.
She is. in the best possible way. You're independent, basically. You're an independent commissioner, independent as appointed by the state government, but independent of the commissioner. And your work over the years in this sector has intersected many times with the archives.
Yep.
I was just wondering if you could tell us, or give us a couple of examples where the archives have done really well in supporting your work for justice and for victims, but also where there are threats to the integrity of the archives for the work you're doing.
Yeah, sure. In thinking about coming today, having worked in child safety here in Queensland, I've given a number of apologies to victims who have experienced abuse as a result of the decisions of the department. And so when you do that, and as part of the redress process that victim survivors go through, you receive all of the archival documents. And I used to think, in a way, I wished all of the people working in the department had access to see those documents that were around the decision making of people like us in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, because what those told you, I would put myself in the shoes of those people and then think about what were the kind of attitudes and assumptions. You could see in there every assumption about what families were like, every assumption about what kept children safe, assumptions about First Nations families and assumptions about what safety for children looked like. And what that used to say to me is, what assumptions are we making today? We might not be making those assumptions, we might be better, but we might still be operating from, I suppose, a lack of evidence or a lack of questioning whether the way we think about the world is right. So that thread for both that person having access, of course, to their documents and being able to explain to them what those documents meant and why we were wholeheartedly apologising for what was in them. A really important part of that process is that from the department, it is a wholehearted apology. It is not saying, oh, that was what people thought at the time. It is an apology, as it should be, for what were unforgivable decisions. But I would say to people, the ability to look back in that way did always mean, having faced the consequences of the past, I always thought about the future and about my decision making in that department now, and not having the comfort of saying, I don't believe the things those people believe, but what do I believe? And what will someone in the future think about the decisions I'm making because of what I believe? And that's a huge, it's a huge power and probably a discredit in the public service that we don't look at that material, except in a context that I'm talking about, but we could look at that material in all sorts of contexts to improve our thinking about the threads that still run in all sorts of government decision making, whether it is as significant in someone's life as the things I'm talking about, or some of the other kind of administrative decisions that that Kath alluded to as well. They are hugely powerful in that way, but often some of the real where trauma still exists is, of course, the gaps, and sometimes what those records show is not always is the lack of thinking in the decision making, and that's a really profoundly difficult thing to say to people, to show where decision making has been, I suppose, really thoughtless and without evidence. And I would love to say I think in the contemporary public service we don't make decisions without evidence, but I would be absolutely lying. And so that is again, it is the power of what we have about all that history of decision making across all of the areas of government decision making. I wish we did think more thoughtfully about how we access that, and I have had the I suppose the privilege of accessing that, which has changed my practice as a public servant from the very profound experiences I have had in that specific context. But I think it probably goes deeper than that across all sorts of decision making.
What about the integrity of the record of the archives? Do you see any threats to the integrity of the archives?
Look, I think probably, I think probably going to what Louise and Simon have said. I'm independent, I can say this. They're not funded enough to have everything, they don't, that to have everything in a way that is accessible. They are incredible institutions, and they have focused on the accessibility of records, I think, rightly around the need and the interest, and I'm sure there's been a lot of focus around certain types of records because we've had royal commissions, because we've had reports, all of those things, but I'm sure they would love to do more. There are gaps in that accessibility that if you were fabulously funded, you would be able to meet all of those gaps. Yes.
So we can see that as one of your recommendations coming up?
I think I can. I think I can feel a systemic recommendation coming up.
Well, we love it. Great outcome already. Yesterday we had the Attorney General here in Queensland announce a statutory review of the Human Rights Act. Is that right? Yes?
Yes.
Does that intersect in any way with what the archives are doing? Catherine?
Look, probably not. I haven't seen the terms of reference for the review, but I understand that it is a review of the operations of the commission itself, and that is something that is required to be done under the statute. Whether the terms of reference have it going beyond that into something, but I think because of the relative young nature of human rights here in Queensland, I doubt that it would go so far back that would require delving into the archives. There may be elements of it that do, but I think by and large it's a contemporary based review.
One of the issues that has come up is the access to information, though, of people in Queensland to seek redress, or is that something that falls under the terms of that review of the Human Rights Act, do you think? I'm asking as a former acting Human Rights Commissioner.
Look, I haven't seen the terms of reference, so I don't know whether it does or it doesn't.
It does talk about victims' rights. It will look at that, and so there may. I know victims are only a slice of what you're talking about, but there may be something in that about rights to information, and certainly in. Sorry, Catherine, I know you know this much more than me, but in the kind of thinking about kind of contemporary human rights, the rights about your information and knowing it, finding it, keeping it, your privacy, all of those things together, I think there's definitely public policy probably lags behind a bit contemporary thinking about those rights.
And it's also the right to information legislation that you can apply to obtain information about a thing or yourself under the Information Privacy Act. Those are still processes that I think are difficult for people to navigate. And although they have been massively simplified over the years, I think there is still room for improvement there. And I'm not sure that when those acts came in, and there was that push towards pushing information out, I'm not sure whether that has happened in practice to the extent that the legislature had envisaged at the time.
And I'm just going to segue around because we've got so much to cover, but we've now got to the right to information and freedom of information side of it. The federal government recently had their proposals to change freedom of information legislation. Well, they basically withdrew it because of the outcry from journalists, the general public, people who needed access to records. How important is, or what role do the archives play in terms of people's freedom of information requests to government?
Well, at a federal level, so from our perspective, there's a bit of a crossover between the freedom of information legislation and the archives legislation. So, and we have a very close working relationship with the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, both from a freedom of information but also from a privacy perspective. But there's an interesting situation where, as I said, with Commonwealth government agencies, you can apply to access records through our legislation that are records that are not necessarily in the control or custody of the archive, so that they're still in government agencies, and that's usually the remit of the Freedom of Information Act. So there's a bit of a crossover there and a bit of a tension about how people can access records. And I know that applicants do go and look for ways of getting access to records, which we'll now have to try and navigate that. So it's not a clean cut. It's not a simple process.
Okay. And in terms of from a legal perspective, because the state archives are now part of Justice Department, aren't they? Yeah, they used to be part of the Main Roads and Works, or.
We've been part of many departments. We're the children of many parents.
Yes.
So previously we were started our life within Public Works we had a close connection to the digital part of government. So digital information, ICT, archives. So that was why we were in that area. But I think very rightly so, there was a recognition that archives, in the same way that we've talked about Archives for Justice, are also part of that integrity framework. I think Coldrake referred to us as part of the integrity patchwork of government. So,
and a large part of your records are from the Justice Department, aren't they?
25%
Yes.
are controlled by the Department of Justice. So it's an awful lot of records.
Prolific creators of
Prolific creators.
I think it's important to recall, though, that those are not just criminal files. So licensing, hotel licenses, registrations. There's a wide range of activity and regulatory activity that the Department of Justice has done over the years that is captured in those records.
An enormous amount. The Department of Justice is an extremely broad church when it comes to its functions and its compliance activities.
And how many of those, because I think only about a very small proportion of your records are still classified, but it's very different for the state archives?
It is, and I don't know the percentage for the justice files. Around 60% of the collection is open. There's probably more records within the criminal justice, so the courts records, magistrates, courts, Supreme Courts, they will have a longer closure period, and rightly so, because those are the records of people's experience through the court system. So the intersection, when you talk about the intersection between RTI in Queensland and our Act, one of the things that is consistent across the two pieces of legislation is information privacy principles and the way in which we classify whether information has a high personal sensitivity to it. And that will help guide us how long those records are closed for and who can access them. And there's a fair component of personal information in some of those files. So, but I have to say, it's not a stat I have off the top of my head.
And we, it's interesting when you look at the different government archives across the country, because we're all same but different. The National Archives access provisions are different to the access provisions under the Queensland legislation, in that for National Archives, our records are automatically open after 20 years from creation. So there's that aspect to the legislation, but we also have caveats in the legislation around national security and national intelligence and a few other things that we need to apply before those records are released. So we actually have a process of examining the records before we release them, and we do that proactively, but we also do that on request from members of the public who have applied for records within the collection. So it's a slightly different, nuanced approach to providing access.
Yes, whereas we have a restricted access notice that's provided to us on transfer of the records.
Right.
So when we receive the records, we already know generally what that, and our new legislation requires that notice to be provided, or the records will be open by default. So.
Now we're coming up very shortly to the Q&A section of this, so we're being wound up. So I'm having to jump over a whole lot of the things that we talked about yesterday and this morning. AI is one of the big or the big elephant in the room now. Just could you tell us what impact is AI having on the collections and your responsibility to record what is going on in government now?
Do you want to go first?
You can go.
Okay, all right, first. So look, I think, and I'll be brief because I know we want to get to the Q&A, but I think AI is a significant challenge for us, but it's a significant opportunity for us as well. There are significant risks that come with using AI, and particularly around the decision making within government and how services are delivered using artificial intelligence. From an archives perspective, there are some significant benefits to be had by using AI in terms of making sure that the records are described or transcribed. It can improve the accessibility of the record, and National Archives is currently running pilots around all of those. We're also in partnership with an ACT technology firm to look at whether we can use artificial intelligence to help agencies understand their unstructured data and what material within that needs to be transferred and ingested into our digital archive. So that's a piece of technology that we are working with this company to develop, which we then hope agencies will pick up, because they'll be able to run that over their unstructured holdings. And we wouldn't have had that 5 or 10 years ago without the ability to do that. So the advancement of technology is one of the problems that agencies face, is that the advancement of technology is creating much larger volumes of government records, and how they deal with those. You can't rely on the way that archives have operated in the past. So I remember going back to I started working in the archives back in 97, so that's showing my age a bit. And I remember going into schools and places like that and sitting in toilet blocks or container sheds and going through boxes and boxes of records to work out what was permanent, what had historical value, what could be destroyed. The world has changed vastly since then, and it's a very technology-driven service delivery from government now, and so we need a technology solution to that, and AI is part of this solution as well as part of the challenge.
Louise, do you use AI?
In small amounts. So we use AI to transcribe some of our open records. So many of the people in the audience probably use Trove. It's a similar type of activity where we use an AI, and then we have volunteers who correct it if it's incorrect. So we use it in there. We're looking at how else we can use it. A little like Simon, there's massive opportunities, and to Simon's point, there is no other way in which the public sector is going to be able to manage the vast amount of information that exists there, and it's being able to weed out the very important, the very permanent records from what they call the DROT, the duplicate, the redundant, the obsolete, the trivial information. How we bring it in and how we manage the risks associated with that is the next challenge, and it's not free. So people talk about bringing in AI to replace people. There's still a cost that you are paying for the compute power. You're paying a cost in the environmental impact of running that. So it's not just a replacement that's going to, a panacea for all ills. I think when cloud computing first came in, it was talked about as though it was going to solve world peace. AI is going through that same type of revolution. There will be really good use cases in the archival industry, but there will be really significant areas where we will not want to put that information into something that is publicly available, where that information is so significant and we need to manage the truth of that information so effectively. I know there are banks in Africa that are struggling with the production of records that are so good, fraudulent identity information, that the banks themselves are actually struggling to stay afloat because they can't manage identifying the fraudulent records. We don't want to get to that point with government records where we don't know which is the record and which is the thing that's being created and is flawed.
Well, it's when governments stop leaving a paper trail, basically.
I don't think it's about a paper trail. I don't think it's about a paper trail. Records are format neutral. Records are created. We're already creating records in social media and WhatsApp chats, in databases. It's about, can we validate the integrity and authenticity of that record in the way that we need to? And that can be done digitally, but with AI, it's another step again. How do we validate that?
Because it's a question of, do you archive a prompt? We're in the process.
Yep. Do you archive the algorithm? If an algorithm is making a decision, is that where in the point? And we used to say, what is the record? I think to Simon's point, pulling it out of the box, is this a permanent record? Is it not? Now it's almost, when is the record? At which point in the experience of this digital creation are we capturing the information that's going to give us that evidence, that decision-making evidence that we need to have?
And I think sorry, just to
no, you go
as well. The other challenge we face building on that is the sort of the nexus between the record, the technology, AI piece, and cybersecurity, and the fact that we've seen over the last few years where there's been significant data breaches of major companies. Optus was probably the first big one that we saw, but there's been many since. Now their instance is where technology has been used to take information out of an organisation, and then they've been blackmailed or ransomed before they release it. I think that's actually, and that has a huge impact on people in terms of identity fraud and theft and things like that. I actually think that is the best case scenario that we're entering into. You imagine the use of technology and AI to be able to break into, let's say a hospital database, like a health system database, and to be able to change en masse the medication that patients need to have, and then doctors giving the wrong medication to a vast array of patients because they're taking the information from the data that's in front of them, which they don't know is not authentic anymore and is not reliable. So I think there's a significant risk that is very real and very near to us, and archives have a significant role to play there because of our the role we play in helping agencies make sure that their record keeping is reliable and authentic and trustworthy.
So please thank Simon Froude, Louise Howard, Kate Connor, and Catherine Scott for their time today, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.